The summer afternoon of 1987 began peacefully in a southern Oklahoma City suburb where doors were left open and children came and went without adult supervision. There were no police cars, no sirens, just the familiar rhythm of a community that believed bad things happened somewhere else. Inside a modest single-story house, the Hayes family went about their afternoon as usual, while 11-year-old Jackson Hayes slipped out of sight for just a short time. No one remembered the exact moment, because it was too ordinary to be noticeable. Only when the sun set and the boy didn't return did the first calls go out. Questions were asked, and the neighborhood's silence took on an entirely different meaning. Later, investigators would determine that this unnoticed interval had become the starting point of a years-long disappearance. No trace, no resolution, and no one in that neighborhood ever imagined they were witnessing the moment a child vanished from his own life. Before diving deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys into forgotten quests for justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. In 1987, Oklahoma City still had the look of a typical Midwestern American city, where life moved slowly and safety came not from surveillance systems or technology, but from habits and community trust. The working-class neighborhoods in the south of the city, near major roads, but separated from the commercial center, were places where children still walked to school alone, visited friends' houses on their own, and were expected to return before dinner without adult escort. People knew each other's faces, families had lived in the same area for years, and the idea that bad things don't happen here felt like common sense. The Hayes family lived in that setting, an ordinary working-class family, no scandals, no public conflicts, with a stable and repetitive weekly routine. Their house was in a neighborhood that wasn't new but was tidy, where kids played in yards and adults greeted each other when they met. Jackson Hayes, 11 years old, was the child in the family at an age confident enough to move around the familiar area alone, but still too young to recognize risks from strangers. Jackson was slim, average height for his age, gentle-natured, not defiant, and tended to trust adults, especially those who seemed friendly. He had a habit of walking short distances around the house for routine errands, routes so repeated that the family no longer saw them as needing close supervision. The afternoon Jackson disappeared started just like many others before it, with familiar activities and no sign that something was about to happen. There were no arguments in the family, no unusual schedule changes, and no clear reason for the adults in the house to be more vigilant than usual. In that very normality, a small detail appeared, not clear enough to be immediately seen as dangerous. The presence of a stranger or a situation not exactly like previous days, but reasonable enough not to raise sharp questions. The initial reaction from those around was the typical hesitation people feel in familiar environments, a fleeting suspicion, quickly dismissed by the habit of trust and the thought that nothing serious was happening. Jackson himself showed no strong reaction or attempt to avoid it, because at his age, danger assessment still depended heavily on how adults presented the situation. The time Jackson left sight happened quietly, with no cries for help, no signs of struggle, and no one witnessing the full moment he left his familiar space. When Jackson didn't return at the usual time, the family began to realize his absence couldn't be explained by ordinary reasons. A spontaneous search was launched almost immediately within the neighborhood, calling his name, checking familiar spots, and asking neighbors. The initial information from witnesses was vague, fragmented, and insufficient to form a clear picture, as each person only remembered very small details and wasn't sure about timing or accuracy. As time passed, and daylight faded, and Jackson still hadn't appeared, the family's worry turned to panic. Initial calm was replaced by fear that what was happening was beyond their ability to resolve, and at that point, the decision to call the police was made as a last resort of the day, marking the moment the Hayes family officially acknowledged Jackson was missing, and they were no longer in control. The missing person call was received by the Oklahoma City Police Department late in the evening, when the city had passed peak hours and shifted to a slower pace, but for the on-duty officers, this was when serious incidents often began to be reported. Initial information was recorded according to procedure for missing minors, focusing not on speculating motives or scenarios, but on confirming that a child had not returned after a period considered safe based on known routine. From the first minutes, The dispatcher faced clear tension from the Hayes family as they tried to explain the situation in a state of disorder, lacking structure and heavily influenced by emotion. Receiving the report was therefore not just note-taking, but a process of filtering, asking the family to go back over specific timelines to separate objective facts from subjective guesses, born of panic. A patrol officer was dispatched to the Hayes home almost immediately to verify the situation and assess whether this was a short-term runaway or a true missing person case, requiring full investigation protocol. Through initial contact, the officer noted that the time Jackson had been gone exceeded normal hours. There was no indication he had announced a change of plans, and the family had conducted a spontaneous search in the area without result. These factors meant the case could not be downplayed or delayed until the next day. On that basis, police officially accepted the case as a missing child, shifting from recording to action. Establishing Jackson Hayes' missing person file was done that same night, following standard procedure of the late 1980s. The file included basic personal information, physical description, most recent photo, family relationships, daily routine, and familiar routes in the area. The goal was not to find answers immediately, but to create a unified data foundation that all involved units could use from the same source, avoiding discrepancies or misunderstandings in coordination. The file was entered into the department's internal system, and copies sent to patrol units operating in nearby areas, ensuring any officer encountering a child matching the description would be alerted immediately. In an era of limited technology, rapid information dissemination relied more on people and processes than automated systems. Thus, establishing the file on the first night was critical, as it laid the groundwork for all subsequent search and verification activities. In parallel with file creation, investigators had to make an initial classification decision for the case, a step directly affecting priority and resource allocation. In missing child cases, police often weigh multiple scenarios: runaway, lost, taken by a known person, or stranger intervention. At the time of the report, there were no clear signs of violence, no scene indicating struggle, and no history of running away or family conflict recorded. These factors meant the runaway assumption could not be ruled out immediately, though Jackson's age made it less convincing than in older teens. At the same time, abduction lacked enough evidence to be designated the primary direction, due to absence of direct proof of coercion. Initial classification was therefore kept open, with multiple possibilities running parallel rather than locking into one direction. This was a cautious decision, but also double-edged, as it could slow resource focus if new data didn't emerge quickly. Despite inability to conclude the case's nature, police still mobilized nighttime investigation resources, knowing the first hours after a child disappears are most critical for gathering initial data. Patrol units were assigned to canvass routes Jackson might have taken, public areas still active in the evening, and potential temporary shelters. The mobilization was not massive as in confirmed abductions, but sufficient to establish police presence in the area, while increasing chances of spotting anomalies if Jackson was still nearby. Officers were instructed to pay special attention to unfamiliar vehicles, individuals behaving inappropriately in a quiet residential setting, and any situations involving children out late. Meanwhile, other units prepared for possible expanded search the next day if the first night yielded nothing. Another key parallel task was pinpointing the exact last moment Jackson was seen safe. This required collecting and cross-referencing accounts from multiple sources, including family members and witnesses contacted earlier during the spontaneous search. The process was slow and careful, as witnesses' memories in the early hours were heavily affected by emotion and fatigue. Investigators didn't seek a complete story immediately, but focused on finding overlaps in accounts to gradually narrow the disappearance window. Through repeated cross-checking, they found Jackson left family sight in a relatively short afternoon window, enough to rule out hours of wandering before outside intervention. Establishing this timeline not only helped narrow search areas, but raised important questions about the speed and nature of what occurred. As the night wore on and the city grew quiet, the investigation continued in a state of urgency tempered by caution. No conclusions were reached in those first hours, but a series of decisions had been made. The case was officially accepted, a missing person file established, initial assumptions weighed, resources mobilized, and the critical timeline determined. These steps marked a clear shift from a family crisis out of control to a case in the hands of law enforcement. From that point, The fate of Jackson Hayes' disappearance no longer depended on spontaneous efforts or random luck, but on how initial investigative decisions were made and how the system responded to a case that at the time, no one could yet confirm was an accident, a voluntary departure, or the start of something far more serious. After the case was officially accepted, the focus of investigative activity in the following hours shifted to pinpointing the central location where Jackson Hayes was determined to have disappeared, a foundational step to establish spatial scope for all subsequent assumptions. Based on the last confirmed timeline from the previous phase, police identified the area of focus not as a contained crime scene typical of criminal cases, but as an open space comprising residential streets, sidewalks, shared yards, and small public areas within Jackson's familiar activity radius. This scoping required careful consideration, as expanding too quickly would dilute resources, while narrowing too soon risked missing key points. Investigators chose a center-outward approach, first identifying places Jackson frequented, likely routes, and areas with limited visibility where a brief incident could occur unnoticed. Unlike scenes with clear boundaries, Jackson's disappearance area was dispersed, forcing police to treat the entire space as an open scene where every square meter could hold information but none stood out as the sole focal point. Scene survey work was conducted with the goal of gathering as many objective observations as possible before environmental and human factors altered the initial context. Officers walked the identified routes, noting lighting conditions, sight lines, traffic density, and neighborhood activity levels at the presumed disappearance time. The survey wasn't aimed at immediately finding conclusive evidence, but at understanding how the space functioned in reality, what could be seen, from where, and for how long. Seemingly minor details like low fences, roadside bushes, or hidden turns were recorded, as they could explain why a child might leave sight quickly without notice. In the process, police noted the disappearance area lacked features commonly associated with violent incidents. No disturbed ground, items left in unusual states, or signs of resistance. Everything appeared in its normal place, reinforcing the initial view that if an event led to Jackson leaving the area, it happened quickly and without disturbance. The absence of violent signs put investigators in a tactically difficult position. On one hand, it helped rule out extreme scenarios early, such as a public attack or prolonged coercion. On the other, lack of violent signs made investigative direction more ambiguous, with no clear anchor to conclude a completed crime or an unrecognized sequence of events. In this context, investigators constantly reminded themselves that no signs did not mean no event, only the limits of what the scene could provide. This was especially true in open spaces, where time and daily human activity could quickly erase faint traces. Thus, instead of seeking decisive evidence, police focused on recording the smallest details, hoping they might mean something different when placed in a larger picture. In parallel with assessing violent signs, systematic evidence search was conducted, though initial expectations were low. Officers scoured the area for objects out of place, overlooked signs or unusual movement, but results were nearly zero. No clear personal items of Jackson's were found in the central area, nor any traces attributable to a third party. The lack of direct physical evidence forced police to face the reality that this scene offered no tangible clues to guide traditional investigation. In 1987 technology conditions, no physical evidence meant no advanced forensic analysis, no biological extraction, and no event reconstruction from physical traces. All efforts now depended on recreating context through witness accounts and spatial reasoning rather than material evidence. As the survey reached its limits, investigators systematically evaluated what the scene could and could not provide. They recognized Jackson's disappearance area, with its open and unbounded nature, was not a place that could hold answers in the traditional sense. Any event here, if it occurred, had blended into the neighborhood's normal rhythm, making it especially hard to distinguish abnormal from familiar. This evaluation led to a temporary strategic conclusion. The scene could only help rule out certain possibilities, not confirm a specific scenario. Continuing to focus too long here risked slowing other investigative directions, especially those based on people and relationships, which might provide more concrete information amid lacking physical evidence. Nevertheless, before leaving the open scene, police conducted a final sweep to ensure no detail was missed due to bias or hate. Notes on terrain, sightlines, and movement flow were compiled, not to resolve the case immediately, but to preserve as part of the file for future cross-referencing if new information emerged. It was at this stage that investigators became more acutely aware of the limits they faced. A disappearance, leaving no clear trace, occurring in a familiar and peaceful space where everything was normal to the point of offering no foothold for suspicion. Assessing the scene's limits was not a failure, but a necessary step to adjust expectations and investigative strategy, helping law enforcement shift from seeking what did merely exist to asking the right questions about what might have happened beyond this space's visibility. As dawn approached and scene survey temporarily concluded, the Jackson Hayes case entered a new phase, where answers would no longer be sought in the neighborhood's familiar streets, but in how scattered pieces of information would connect in the investigative steps to come. When the on-scene investigation failed to yield any specific physical clues, the focus of the investigation had to shift entirely to people, starting with the Hayes family, the last ones to have direct and regular contact with Jackson before he disappeared. Family interviews were conducted separately, in accordance with procedure to minimize cross-influence on their accounts, and focused on reconstructing the day of the incident in as much detail as possible. Investigators did not just ask about major events, but delved into small daily habits, because in child disappearance cases, it is often those seemingly unimportant details that determine the establishment of the time and circumstances of the vanishing. The family was asked to sequentially describe Jackson's morning, noon, and afternoon, the activities he engaged in, any instructions given, and any changes, however minor, from his usual routine. This process unfolded slowly and was frequently interrupted by emotions, as family members struggled to recall details while confronting the fear that their ordinary decisions might have contributed to the gap that led to the disappearance. Investigators noted no major factual contradictions between the accounts, but there were differences in how each person perceived and assessed the normality of the situations that occurred that day, indicating that their memories had begun to be affected by panic and self-blame from the very first hours. After completing the family interviews, police expanded their approach to direct and indirect witnesses in the area, including neighbors, Jackson's peers, and anyone who might have seen him during the critical time frame. These interviews were conducted in layers, starting with those closest spatially, then gradually extending to those with only indirect contact or fleeting sightings of Jackson. The goal was not to immediately find a decisive witness, but to gather as many independent points of observation as possible in order to cross-reference and eliminate incompatible possibilities. However, even at this stage, investigators faced a familiar issue in cases occurring in quiet residential areas. Witnesses' memories were often imprecise regarding timing, as repetitive daily routines made it hard for them to distinguish the day of the incident from preceding one. Many witnesses believed they had seen Jackson, but could not be certain it was on the exact day he disappeared or just a nearby day. Others only recalled the image of a boy with a similar build, but could not confirm identity. Investigators had to record all these statements, knowing that most would not be directly usable, because overlooking them early could lead to irremediable gaps later. From the data collected from the family and witnesses, the investigation team began constructing an official timeline for the day Jackson disappeared, treating it as the backbone of the entire case. This timeline was not built on a single account but resulted from overlaying multiple time markers, each evaluated for reliability and degree of alignment with other statements. Time periods confirmed by multiple witnesses were prioritized in the main framework, while markers based on a single source were flagged for further verification. The timeline building process revealed a picture that was not entirely seamless, with many gaps interspersed among confirmed markers, reflecting the reality that Jackson had moved within a familiar but intermittently supervised environment. This made pinpointing the exact moment he left sight more difficult, as the disappearance did not occur in a clear-cut instant, but as the result of a series of unattended intervals. Investigators paid special attention to time markers where family and witness accounts began to diverge, viewing them as points requiring more thorough analysis in subsequent steps. In the process of cross-referencing statements, small but meaningful inconsistencies gradually emerged, not in the form of completely contradictory claims, but as differences in details and interpretation. Some witnesses remembered Jackson appearing hurried, while others said he was completely calm. Some believed he had spoken with an adult before leaving, but could not clearly describe who that person was or how the exchange went. These inconsistencies were not enough to conclude that anyone was deliberately concealing information, but they highlighted the instability of human memory in stressful situations. Investigators recorded each inconsistency, categorized them by severity, and tried to determine whether they stemmed from natural confusion or from witnesses unconsciously adding details based on personal speculation. This was particularly important because in child disappearance cases, erroneous assumptions formed from vague statements can quickly become truth in collective perception, leading the investigation astray from the start. One of the key tasks in the initial investigation phase was identifying time gaps, periods not covered by any reliable statement. These gaps were considered the most likely places where the event leading to Jackson's disappearance occurred, as they were the moments when he was outside the sight of family, witnesses, or any other supervisory factor. Investigators clearly marked these gaps on the timeline with notes on possible related locations and circumstances, in preparation for re-interviewing witnesses or expanding the investigation in other directions. Identifying time gaps did not provide immediate answers, but it helped narrow the range of questions investigators needed to ask, shifting focus from searching for Jackson everywhere to understanding what might have happened in those critical minutes or hours. At the same time, this process also exposed the limitations of the data police held, as most information relied on human memory, a factor easily distorted by time and emotion. As the initial investigation phase drew to a close, the team faced an unfavorable reality. They had gathered many statements, built a reasonable timeline, identified inconsistencies and gaps, but still lacked a strong enough clue to point to a clear direction for the case. What they had was a fragmented picture, with pieces present but not yet fitting into a complete image. However, this phase was not seen as a failure but as a necessary step to establish the foundation for subsequent decisions, as it clearly defined what was known, what was unknown, and which assumptions needed verification. In that context, continuing the investigation required not only patience, but also the ability to continually reassess initial data, to avoid inadvertently linking insufficiently grounded details into a seemingly plausible but inaccurate narrative. The initial investigation into Jackson Hayes's disappearance thus ended in an open state, with many unanswered questions but also with a clear enough analytical framework to guide the next steps. When the initial investigation phase failed to provide a clear direction, search and tracking operations were elevated to top priority, based on the assumption that if Jackson Hayes was still in or near his familiar area, early expansion of the search could create opportunities for critical discoveries before time diminished the ability to gather information. The search was initiated from the closest radius around the point where Jackson disappeared, focusing on spaces he could access in a short time without assistance from others. Search teams swept block by block, pedestrian paths, vacant lots, small parks, and low-traffic areas where a child might stop or temporarily hide. The close radius search involved both police forces and community volunteers familiar with the terrain and capable of spotting minor environmental changes. However, that very familiarity posed a challenge, as most areas were regularly used by residents, making it hard to distinguish traces related to Jackson from normal daily activity. Search teams had to constantly adjust their approach, recording every observation no matter how minor, but results in the early stage remained inconclusive, with no clear signs that Jackson had lingered or gotten lost within this range. When the close radius search yielded no results, the operation had to expand beyond the familiar residential area, leading to changes in strategy and resource allocation. The search area was extended along the most likely directions based on Jackson's movement habits and established time markers, including routes leading out of the neighborhood, larger public spaces, and areas connecting to other residential zones. This expansion aimed not only to directly locate Jackson, but also to detect any indirect signs that he had left the initial area, such as sightings reports, information from nearby residents, or unusual environmental changes. Search teams faced mounting pressure, as each passing hour reduced the chances of detecting fragile traces while increasing expectations from the family and community for an imminent breakthrough. However, expanding the area also meant dispersing resources, forcing commanders to continually assess the effectiveness of each covered zone to prevent the search from becoming perfunctory and unfocused. Given the possibility that Jackson might have left the city limits shortly after disappearing, police began establishing coordination channels with state and federal law enforcement. This coordination was not ostentatious, but implemented cautiously, appropriate to the available information. Oklahoma State Police units were notified of the disappearance, with basic descriptions and identifying features of Jackson, to ensure any contact with a similarly matching child would be noted and reported. At a higher level, case information was shared with federal agencies responsible for supporting missing children cases, not to transfer responsibility, but to broaden the alert network in case Jackson had crossed local boundary. This coordination reflected the investigation team's growing recognition that the case might no longer be confined to a neighborhood or even a city, and that keeping information narrow could delay response if Jackson appeared elsewhere. In parallel with expanding the area and interagency coordination, another key tracking direction was examining major transportation routes, based on the assumption that if Jackson had been taken out of the initial area, it most likely occurred via roads connecting the city to surrounding regions. Patrol units were assigned to check major highways, vehicle stops, and high-traffic intersections during the relevant time frame. The goal was not only direct location of Jackson, but also detection of indirect reports, such as a child appearing in age or context inappropriate places, or vehicles exhibiting unusual behavior at the time. However, without detailed descriptions of a vehicle or specific suspect, route checks were more broad than targeted, making effectiveness dependent on luck and individual observation. Reports gathered in this phase were mostly speculative, insufficient to confirm Jackson had traveled any of those routes. As search and tracking directions were pursued simultaneously without clear results, the investigation team faced a growing reality. Jackson's disappearance left no traces that traditional search methods could easily detect. The absence of specific signs, despite thorough close and expanded sweeps, suggested that if Jackson had left the initial area, it might have happened quickly and unobtrusively, or been concealed skillfully enough to avoid obvious signal. The lack of clear traces not only posed operational difficulties, but also strongly impacted the morale of search participants, as each passing day diminished hope that finding Jackson safe was feasible in the short term. Nevertheless, investigation commanders maintained search activities for a set period, aware that stopping too soon could create a sense of abandonment for both family and community. When search resources began reaching their limits, a comprehensive evaluation was conducted to assess the effectiveness of efforts expended and the viability of continuing current direction. The evaluation showed that despite significant area expansion and mobilization of multiple agencies, the case still revealed no specific clues to advance to a new phase. This forced the team to reconsider strategy, shifting focus from physical searching to data analysis and assumptions, preparing for the possibility that the case was no longer within reach of immediate tracking measures. The absence of clear traces in the search and tracking phase was not seen as a final conclusion, but it marked an important boundary for the investigation, signaling the end of the primarily action-based phase, and the need to re-examine everything known amid time and silence, becoming the most dominant factors in the fate of Jackson Hayes' disappearance. When search and tracking activities yielded no specific signs, the investigation had to enter a more analytical phase, where investigators set aside physical searching to focus on determining what was most likely to have happened based on the limited available facts. This was the point where investigative assumptions began forming clearly, not as conclusions, but as frameworks to organize information and direct remaining resources. The first assumption raised was the possibility that Jackson had run away voluntarily, a common scenario in child disappearances, especially without signs of violence at the scene. The team examined Jackson's age, family environment, behavioral history, and social relationships to assess this likelihood. Jackson was too young to plan a prolonged departure without support, had no money, and showed no signs of expressing a desire to escape family or school responsibilities. The Hayes family also reported no serious conflicts in the period immediately before his disappearance, making the runaway assumption less convincing than in cases of older teens. However, it could not be entirely ruled out, as retaining all possibilities in the absence of evidence is a safety principle in investigation. The existence of the runaway assumption, though low probability, still influenced police approach, particularly in delaying classification as a serious criminal case from the outset. The second assumption considered was that Jackson had been taken by someone known to him, a scenario common in disappearances in quiet residential areas where children are familiar with many surrounding adults, and less wary. Investigators reviewed the list of people with direct or indirect ties to the Hayes family, including relatives, friends, neighbors, and those regularly present in Jackson's daily life. This assumption was rated more credible than running away, as it could explain the quick, unnoticed disappearance. A child going with a trusted person would not appear unusual to onlookers. However, verifying it faced many obstacles, as there was no evidence Jackson got into a vehicle or left with a specific person, and no witness could confirm a contact clear enough for deeper investigation. Re-interviews of listed contacts yielded no new information and uncovered no clear inconsistencies warranting prioritization of a subject. This left the known person assumption in limbo, reasonable enough to retain but lacking data to become the primary direction. The third assumption was the possibility of an accident, where Jackson might have encountered an unintended incident, preventing return or detection during searches. Investigators assessed potential hazards in Jackson's activity area, including vacant lots, unfinished construction, areas near water, or spaces dangerous for unsupervised children. The accident assumption initially carried weight, especially without signs of third-party involvement. However, prior searches had thoroughly covered high-risk areas without finding any indication of such an incident. The absence of any traces, clothing, personal items, or environmental disturbance significantly weakened the accident assumption, though theoretically it remained unexcludable. The team had to acknowledge that if an accident occurred, it did so beyond the reach of standard search measures. After examining each assumption independently, investigators moved to evaluating their relative probabilities, based on combining actual facts, professional experience, and the case's social context. No assumption reached a level strong enough to be the dominant explanation, nor was any weak enough for complete elimination. The runaway assumption was rated lowest probability, but had the greatest impact on system response if over-prioritized, as it could reduce case urgency. The known person assumption had medium probability, but lacked specific anchors for deep investigation. The accident assumption had theoretical basis, but contradicted field search results. The fragile balance among assumptions created an unstable investigative state, where every direction could be right or wrong, and misprioritizing risked depleting resources without progress. It was at this phase that the influence of investigative assumptions on resource allocation became evident. With finite resources, commanders had to decide whether to continue expanded searching, intensify human interviews, or shift to awaiting new information. Inability to identify a dominant assumption led to splitting resources across multiple directions, reducing overall effectiveness of individual activity. Some personnel continued checking accident risk areas despite low likelihood, others maintained contact with family and community for new tips, while remaining investigators reanalyzed collected data for overlooked detail. This dispersion was not due to indecision, but a direct consequence of lacking strong evidence for decisive choices. Over time, however, that dispersion weakened breakthrough potential, as no direction received sufficient depth to overcome impact. As investigative assumptions were maintained in parallel without significant progress, an unavoidable reality emerged. The Jackson-Hayes case did not fit familiar patterns investigators typically rely on for quick resolution. The absence of clear signs made every assumption more speculative than conclusive, and each resource decision carried risk of oversight. The investigative assumptions phase was thus not purely analytical, but a test of the system, forcing law enforcement to operate in the gray area between action and waiting, between continued searching and acknowledging some answers might not appear immediately. In that context, assumptions became more than professional tools. They shaped the entire case trajectory, directly affecting resource use, expectation management, and ultimately how Jackson-Hayes' disappearance gradually shifted from emergency response to a prolonged where time became a silent but weighty adversary in the investigation. As the parallel investigative leads were deployed but failed to produce a breakthrough, a familiar phenomenon in child disappearance cases began to emerge with increasing intensity. A wave of sightings reports for Jackson-Hayes from various sources. These tips came from residents in the city and surrounding areas, often starting with a less than certain assertion that they had seen a boy matching Jackson's description at a particular location or time. Each report, taken individually, carried the slim possibility of being a critical clue, forcing police to treat it seriously, as overlooking any information at this stage carried irreversible risks. However, the volume of reports grew rapidly over time, reflecting not only the community's search efforts but also the widespread dissemination of information about the disappearance, blurring the line between useful data and noise. Investigators had to establish a dedicated process for handling sightings reports, ensuring every tip was logged, categorized, and verified by priority level, rather than reacting emotionally to external pressure. Verifying each sighting required far more effort than it appeared on the surface, as every tip needed cross-checking against the established timeline, relevant locations, and Jackson's identifying features. Investigators had to recontact the tipster, asking them to describe in detail the circumstances of the sighting, observation distance, lighting conditions, and why they believed the person seen was Jackson. In many cases, when placed in specific context, the witness's certainty quickly diminished, revealing that initial memory had been influenced by information received afterward, such as Jackson's images on flyers or descriptions circulating in the community. Some reports were immediately ruled out when timelines and locations directly contradicted confirmed facts. Others required deeper investigation, including sending officers to the reported site, canvassing the area, and checking whether anyone matching the description had been present. Though time-consuming, most of these verification efforts ended without concrete results, heightening the sense that the investigation was chasing shadows rather than real leads. As the number of reports increased, a systemic issue began to surface: widespread misidentifications of Jackson Hayes with other children of similar age and build. In a large city and its surrounding areas, having multiple children with similar features was inevitable, especially when the identifying description lacked truly unique markers. Investigators realized that many sightings did not stem from Jackson actually appearing in those places, but from the natural human tendency to seek matches when provided with an image and a story. This phenomenon made the reports increasingly unreliable, not because tipsters were deliberately misleading, but because their perception had been shaped by a desire to contribute to resolving the case. Discovering the extent of common misidentifications forced police to handle new information more cautiously, yet it also put them in a difficult position, as tightening verification criteria risked overlooking a genuinely important tip. The direct consequence of this wave of noisy reports was that the investigation began to fragment, with resources stretched in multiple directions without any strong enough to produce clear progress. Investigators had to divide time between verifying new tips, maintaining contact with the family, and continuing to analyze old data, while pressure from the community and media steadily mounted. This fragmentation not only reduced the effectiveness of individual activities, but also made maintaining an overall picture of the case more difficult, as potential leads continually emerged and were then dismissed. Each time a report was verified and deemed unrelated, it not only consumed time and effort, but also eroded the morale of those involved in the investigation, as brief hope was raised and quickly extinguished. Gradually, investigators found themselves spending more time reacting to new information than proactively building a long-term strategy, a sign that the investigation was losing control of its pace. In that context, the absence of any new verifiable leads became a hard-to-accept but undeniable reality. Every avenue explored led back to the starting point, and each investigative hypothesis was worn down by the lack of evidence. Sightings reports continued to come in, but their informational value steadily declined, as they failed to lead to any specific discoveries about Jackson's location or condition. The investigative team had to acknowledge that despite receiving and processing a massive volume of information, they were no closer to answers than in the early days after the report. This impasse did not arrive suddenly but formed gradually through a chain of fruitless efforts, making it increasingly difficult in practice to sustain the initial level of urgency. As the phase of noise and stalemate dragged on, investigative commanders began reassessing the entire trajectory of the case, not in search of an immediate miracle, but to determine how to maintain attention and resources amid no progress. The lack of new leads forced the system to confront its own limits, as traditional investigative tools were insufficient to pierce the silence enveloping the case. For the Hayes family, this stalemate carried the deepest pain, as each false report was not just a personal disappointment, but a reminder that Jackson remained somewhere beyond everyone's reach. For the investigative team, it marked a shift from a reactive phase to one of endurance, where the goal was no longer quick resolution, but keeping the case from fading into oblivion. In that state, the investigation approached the fragile boundary between continuation and pause, between hope and reality, preparing for a turning point, not from immediate action, but from the slow shift of time and the surrounding context of Jackson Hayes's disappearance. As ongoing investigative efforts continued to yield no verifiable leads, the intensity of handling Jackson Hayes's disappearance began to gradually decrease through a process not publicly announced, but clearly evident within the system. Reducing intensity did not mean abandoning the case, but reflected a professional reality. Emergency measures had been fully deployed within the limits of available information, and maintaining the same resource level would no longer produce proportional value. Dedicated shifts were cut back. The number of patrol units assigned exclusively to the case was reduced, and large-scale searches were no longer conducted as frequently. Instead, the case shifted to a monitoring status, where new information was still received but no longer triggered widespread immediate responses. This decision followed multiple internal reviews, where investigative commanders weighed the need to sustain hope against the duty to allocate resources to newer cases with clearer evidence. In that context, scaling back the investigation was more an administrative step than an emotional one, though it created a growing gap between the family's expectations and the system's operational reality. Alongside the reduced intensity, Jackson Hayes's missing person file was reorganized for archiving, a procedural step with deep symbolic meaning for any case. All documents collected during the initial response phase, including interview transcripts, scene notes, search report, and verified tips, were rearranged chronologically and thematically to ensure that if the case was revisited in the future, the new handler could quickly grasp the overall picture without sifting through scattered data. Archiving the file did not eliminate investigative responsibility, but changed the approach. Rather than active searching, the case was placed in a posture of waiting for new information, with any emerging data added to the file under the same established standard. For the Hayes family, this process was largely invisible, as they were not informed of every administrative detail, but the change was evident in sparser police contact and updates, lacking immediacy. Along with archiving, another change occurred quietly, but with long-term impact on the case's trajectory: reassignment of lead investigators. The original detectives, who had closely followed the case during its most intense phase, were gradually reassigned to other duties or transferred per unit need. The Jackson Hayes case no longer had an individual or small team directly responsible daily, but was handed to a records management unit whose primary task was preserving data and receiving new information when it arose. This shift was not due to personal failure, but a consequence of how the system operates when a case lingers without progress. However, losing personnel continuity meant that small details, intuitions, and subtle connections accumulated by the original investigators were hard to fully convey through written record. Gradually, the case became a set of documents rather than a living story in the minds of law enforcement, a transformation that might not affect immediately, but carried long-term consequences for any future reactivation. When all these factors converged, Jackson Hayes's disappearance was officially classified as a cold case, a term both technical and psychologically heavy. Professionally, this classification meant the case was no longer handled under emergency protocols, but remained open for receiving and evaluating new information if it appeared. It also meant placement on the list of unsolved cases, where time became the central factor governing subsequent decisions. On a human level, labeling it a cold case marked a shift in perception, from an urgent situation requiring immediate action to an unanswered question persisting in the system without a clear timeline for resolution. For the Hayes family, it meant confronting a new state where hope was no longer tied to specific daily searches, but became an indefinite wait without end. The transition to cold case did not occur as a single decision, but as the result of numerous small choices accumulated over time, each reasonable in its context, but together forming a major turning point for the case. Reducing investigative intensity, archiving the file, reassigning investigators, and classifying the case reflected the system's limits when facing disappearances, leaving no clear traces under the technology and data conditions of that era. Nevertheless, classifying it as a cold case was not an end, but an acknowledgement that the answer, if it existed, would not come from familiar emergency measures, but from a different future context, where new tools or previously unknown information might alter the view of the entire case. At this point, Jackson Hayes's disappearance entered a phase of quiet, where silence was no longer the gap between actions, but the default state, enveloping both the investigative system and those still silently awaiting a sign that the case had not completely faded into oblivion. While the missing person file for Jackson Hayes gradually settled in the Oklahoma City archives, another life continued a few hundred miles away in Wichita, Kansas, where a teenager grew up under a completely different identity with no one around questioning it. This boy appeared in local records not as a child with a complicated past, but as an ordinary case, enrolling slightly later than peers and living in a relatively closed environment. In Wichita, there was no collective memory of where he came from, as his presence was taken as a given in daily life, like many families who moved to the city in the late 19th. The initial lack of questions was not due to indifference, but a product of a social context, where communities often accepted change without demanding detailed explanations, as long as everything operated within familiar norms. The legal identity this teenager carried was sufficient for basic societal interactions, but lacked the depth of a complete record. Name, date of birth, and basic personal information were noted in administrative forms, but traces from early life, such as newborn medical records or original birth certificates, were virtually absent from local systems. Instead, substitute documents were used, meeting minimal requirements for school and public services, but not providing a seamless data chain from birth. At that time, such gaps were not immediately seen as unusual, as federal verification processes were not yet standardized, and interstate moves often created data voids without tools for tight scrutiny. Thus, this legal identity existed as a valid shell, covering a past that went unquestioned. The absence of original documents was not just administrative, but directly affected how the teenager was perceived and treated in his surroundings. Without full childhood medical records, early developmental milestones went undocumented, and family history remained unclear. But these gaps were rarely probed, as they did not visibly hinder daily activities. At school, he was evaluated based on current behavior and performance, not origin details. In social interactions, past stories were minimized or avoided, not through elaborate staging, but because silence became the easiest way to maintain normalcy. Over time, the lack of original documents became part of the new life, accepted as an unexplained trait as long as it caused no direct issues. A consistent aspect of this teenager's life was a tendency to avoid deep contact with government agencies and situations requiring high-level identity verification. This showed not through overt resistance or evasion, but through choosing the least confrontational paths, limiting complex administrative procedures, avoiding services needing full records, and maintaining a narrow activity circle to avoid explanations about origin. This avoidance appeared not as specific fear, but as a habit formed over time, reflecting awareness that keeping things simple was best to prevent unwanted questions. To those around him, it seemed like a private family or quiet teen, not a sign of deeper issues. In that environment, the teenager in Wichita grew up with a vague sense of self, not because he knew he was hiding something, but because his past did not exist as a fully told story. Earliest memories lacked clear framing, and origin questions were rarely encouraged to deep. Life continued by inertia, with school years passing, relationships forming and fading, and a legal identity sufficient to exist in society without drawing attention. It was this surface normalcy that made life under a different identity sustainable, as it created no conflicts large enough to invite outside intervention. From the system's perspective, this teenager was just a scattered record among countless others, with no standout factors to trigger alert. But from the story's viewpoint, his existence under a different identity reflected a central paradox of long-term disappearances. A person could vanish completely from their old context, yet live another life in plain societal view, as long as administrative pieces were never placed side by side. In Wichita, Kansas, that life continued in silence, entirely separate from the dusty cold case file in Oklahoma City, creating two parallel realities that at this point showed no signs of intersecting. The life of the teenager growing up in Wichita continued at a rhythm that seemed stable and no different from that of his peers, as most of his time was filled with simple, repetitive daily activity. Days began and ended in a familiar order, with going to school, returning home, doing small chores around the house, and spending free time on activities that required little social interaction. There were no signs that he was living in a state of confinement or strict control, but every choice in his routine tended toward safety and discretion, as if this life had been designed to avoid unexpected situations. Those habits formed gradually over the years, not from any specific command, but from repeatedly choosing the lowest risk behaviors, allowing him to exist without needing to ask questions or face demands that exceeded his ability to explain. The regularity of daily life, on the surface, created the impression of a normal existence, but it also concealed the absence of important personal milestones that most other children experience. In the school environment, this teenager integrated at the minimum level necessary, enough to avoid being seen as an outlier, but not enough to become a prominent part of the group. Enrollment and attendance proceeded smoothly on paper, thanks to the pre-established legal identity, but the lack of information about his early years left his school record with a vague starting point, unconnected to any prior school or location. Teachers in the school approached him as a transfer student, a common occurrence in the context of families moving within the state, so initial curiosity quickly gave way to evaluations based on current behavior. In class, he caused no trouble but rarely participated voluntarily, maintaining a safe position on the edges of group activities. Academic performance was kept at a level sufficient to meet minimum requirements, avoiding both extremes of standing out too much or falling behind, as if the goal was not to maximize potential, but to maintain the stability needed to avoid attention. The teenager's social relationships clearly reflected this quiet survival strategy. His circle remained narrow, centered mainly on a few familiar classmates and close family members, without expanding to larger social groups or activities requiring rigor commitment. He was not completely isolated or ostracized, but he always maintained a certain distance, enough to avoid personal questions in situations that demanded sharing about his past. In social interactions, he tended to listen more than speak, react rather than initiate, and withdraw when conversations touched on topics that might lead to explaining his origins or personal history. To peers, this appeared as a quiet or introverted personality, not unusual enough to raise suspicion, but over time, it created an invisible wall preventing him from becoming a full part of any community. What is noteworthy is that throughout his growth under this substitute identity, the teenager had no clear awareness that he was living a story different from the truth. There were no fully formed memories of early life to compare against, no unified past narrative to question, and no one around him encouraging deeper exploration of what had happened before. Any fragmented memories, if they existed, were not connected into a coherent timeline, but remained as vague, nameless sensations that were easy to overlook. The lack of awareness of his true identity was not the result of deliberate self-deception, but a consequence of growing up in an environment where the past was not considered necessary for building the present. When there are no questions, there is no need to seek answers. This absence of awareness about his true identity allowed the substitute life to continue relatively smoothly, as it eliminated any clear internal conflict between who I am and who I am said to be. The teenager in Wichita did not live in a state of constant fear or feeling pursued, but in a prolonged normalization where everything was accepted as it was. This enabled him to adapt to his surroundings without needing complex defense mechanisms, but it also made his personal identity fragile, entirely dependent on what was provided from the outside. There was no comparison between personal memories and social records, as both lacked clear anchors. Over time, this substitute life created a paradox. The longer he lived in this assumed normality, the less likely he was to recognize the abnormality. Gaps in records, blanks in his personal story, and avoidance choices gradually became the norm, no longer felt as signs of something wrong. He grew up, changing physically and psychologically like any other teenager, experiencing phases of confusion, insecurity, and self-searching, but without linking those emotions to any specific past event. Instead, they were interpreted as universal experiences of growing up, requiring no deeper cause. In this context, the substitute life was not just a temporary phase, but became the foundation for the teenager's entire process of personal formation. Every decision, from choosing friends, responding to conflict, to envisioning the future, was built on an identity without clear origins, but functional enough to exist. It was precisely this sufficiency that allowed life to continue without significant resistance, while concealing the reality that he was living in the invisible gap between a severed past and a pieced-together present. In Wichita, Kansas, that substitute life stretched through school years, changing seasons, and fleeting relationships, creating a shell so stable that no one, including the teenager himself, had reason to suspect that behind it lay a different story waiting to be recognized. Over time, even though the teenager's substitute life in Wichita continued to appear normal on the surface, certain persistent signs of discrepancy began to quietly accumulate in official recording systems, creating anomalies not clear enough to trigger immediate alerts, but sufficient to exist as small cracks in the administrative picture. In school records, the irregularity manifested first in the vague starting point: no complete transfer records, no prior grade reports or evaluations from earlier grades, and no continuity of data reflecting academic development from early childhood. For the school, this was explained as a consequence of relocation or common administrative oversights in less stable families, but overall, the teenager's file showed a prolonged gap that could not be filled with standard supplementary documents. Teachers noted that he integrated just enough to avoid attention, but also observed consistent reserve in any activities requiring self-sharing, from personal assignments to casual conversations outside class. These comments were not treated as serious issues, but were retained as scattered notes, reflecting a student who existed in the system without leaving much personal imprint. Parallel to school records, the teenager's medical file also revealed ongoing incompleteness, especially regarding infancy and early childhood. There were no data on birth, initial vaccinations, or early developmental milestones, and this information was never supplemented over time, as no mandatory requirements forced clarification. In encounters with the local healthcare system, the teenager was recorded only minimally, with routine visits and no clear medical history. This deficiency did not directly hinder access to services, but it created a fragmented file that did not reflect a seamless developmental process like most other children. For healthcare workers, it might be seen as the result of a family not retaining old records or moving from elsewhere. But the complete absence of original data, persisting for years without supplementation, was a rare characteristic, though not severe enough to be deemed seriously abnormal in the technological and procedural context of the time. These signs of discrepancy were reinforced by the teenager's consistent avoidance behavior in situations requiring verification or sharing of personal information. The avoidance was not confrontational or resistant, but manifested through silence, vague responses, or withdrawal from conversations that could lead to recounting the past. In school, he rarely participated in activities involving family stories, origins, or childhood memories, and when required, his answers were brief and lacking detail. In social interactions outside school, he avoided situations that might place him in the spotlight, maintaining a presence sufficient to avoid seeming eccentric, but not enough for deep intimacy. This avoidance behavior was not recognized as a deliberate strategy but as a reflex formed over time, reflecting an awareness that maintaining distance was the safest way to preserve the current normal state. Another prominent feature in this picture of persistent discrepancy was the near-complete absence of a coherently narrated childhood history. There were no frequently mentioned family stories, no shared memories of early years, and no clear ties to a specific past location or community. For those around him, this could be explained as the result of a difficult childhood or a private family, but over time, the absence became noticeable to anyone in prolonged contact. The teenager seemed to lack memory anchors to return to, no personal milestones repeatedly referenced to shape identity, and no clear timeline extending from past to present. This did not cause an obvious crisis in the early stages, but it created a fragile foundation for personal identity formation, where the question "where do I come from?" was not asked, yet no answer was available if it ever arose. These persistent signs of discrepancy coexisted with the substitute life without direct collision, as each system saw only a very small part of the overall picture. The school saw a quiet student with incomplete transfer records, healthcare saw a young patient with minimal data, and the community saw a reserved teenager who caused no trouble. There was no mechanism at the time strong enough to piece these fragments together and question the overall inconsistency. This fragmentation allowed the signs of discrepancy to persist for years without detection or challenge, as each individual anomaly could be reasonably explained within the narrow context of its system. Over time, these irregularities not only reflected an administrative issue, but also influenced how the teenager viewed himself and the world around him. The lack of a clear childhood history, combined with avoidance habits and the fragmentation of official records, created a prolonged sense of vagueness about identity, though not yet fully conscious. He existed in the present without a past as foundation, a state that could be sustained for a long time when everything ran smoothly, but carried the risk of becoming a breaking point when life demanded more forced answers. At this stage, the signs of discrepancy had not yet converged into a clear problem, but they had established a quiet trajectory, where inconsistency did not fade over time, but gradually accumulated, awaiting some future condition to be placed side by side and recognized as an undeniable whole. As he entered adolescence, natural physical and psychological changes began to intensify, bringing with them a need to form personal identity that had not previously been clearly demanded in the substitute life in Wichita. This was the stage when most teenagers start questioning their place in family, society, and the future. But for this teenager, the process unfolded in a context lacking a clear past foundation. Maturation did not bring a sense of expansion or freedom, but exposed more clearly the long-existing gaps, as questions about who am I and where do I come from began to emerge without any ready answers to grasp. In school and social settings, he continued to maintain a discreet presence, but the avoidance strategies that had worked earlier gradually became less sustainable, as adolescence required clearer self-definition to engage in relationships and plan for the future. A feeling of not belonging began to form distinctly, not from a specific event, but from the accumulation of small experiences that made him realize he always stood on the periphery of every social structure. At school, when peers shared about family, childhood memories, or long-standing connections, he noticed he had no similar stories to contribute. Seemingly ordinary occasions, like commemorative events, graduations, or discussions about future plans, became quiet reminders that he lacked a past anchor to shape his path forward. This feeling did not manifest as rebellion or opposition, but existed as an internal distance, where he was physically present, but always felt he did not fully belong. Gradually, not belonging became a familiar state, leading him to lower his own expectations and accept the role of observer rather than full participant. Alongside this was an increasingly evident internal conflict, arising from the clash between the need to understand himself and the anxiety about delving into an unclear path. On one hand, he began to sense inconsistencies in his personal story, from gaps in records to the vagueness of earliest memories. On the other, questioning origins meant risking disruption of his current life, which, though imperfect, was stable enough to sustain. This conflict left him in prolonged inner turmoil, where curiosity was suppressed by a vague fear that seeking answers could lead to unpredictable consequences. With no one around actively encouraging or supporting this identity exploration, he had to grapple with his thoughts in silence. These internal conflicts did not erupt into an immediate clear crisis, but manifested through subtle changes in behavior and attitude. He became more withdrawn, shared fewer personal thoughts, and tended to narrow rather than expand social relationships. Decisions about the future, such as choosing educational or career paths, were made cautiously and without long-term direction, as he lacked a clear sense of his starting point from which to build goals. The absence of a coherent personal narrative made all plans feel temporary, as if life was unfolding in an undefined waiting period where he only tried to maintain the status quo rather than actively shape the future. Notably, throughout this period, he still had no concrete explanation for his origins, not because he avoided asking questions, but because there was no data to pursue answers. Any vague memories from very early life, if they existed, were not clear enough to identify places, people, or events, and no one around provided additional information to clarify. The lack of resolution was not just an informational issue, but a psychological one, as it created a void where imagination and speculation could fill in uncontrollably. He might sense that something remained unsaid, but had no idea where to start exploring, nor whether that exploration would bring relief or only increase instability. Over time, the identity crisis did not appear as a violent storm, but as a persistent undercurrent, affecting how he viewed himself and relationships around him. He did not completely reject his current self, but could not fully embrace it either, due to the missing continuity between past and present. This state left him both existing in society and outside it, both accepting the substitute life and sensing something incomplete. The absence of resolution about origins was no longer just an administrative detail or data gap, but became the center of a quiet internal struggle, where questions of identity were not voiced, but always present in small decisions and his reactions to the world. As adolescence gradually drew to a close, the conflicts and feelings of not belonging did not vanish, but were carried forward as part of his baggage into adulthood. Life continued, but the foundation of identity remained fragile, relying more on what had been built in the present than what was acknowledged from the past. In that state, this teenager crossed into a new age, without a complete story to tell about himself, only a vague sense that his life had begun somewhere in the middle, and that the years before, even if they existed, remained beyond the reach of memory and understanding. It was precisely this absence of resolution that laid the groundwork for deeper changes in the future, when the scattered pieces would finally have the chance to be placed side by side, though at this point there was no sign that it was about to happen. As the teenager in Wichita gradually crossed the age threshold where interactions with the administrative system became more frequent and complex, inconsistencies that had quietly existed for years began to reach the limit where automated processes could no longer overlook them. The first and most obvious issue emerged around the Social Security number used in the current legal identity, a number long regarded as the cornerstone for linking individual records within the U.S. public administration system. Over time, this Social Security number revealed inconsistencies when cross-referenced with other data points, such as the issuance date, registration region, and supporting records that should have existed in parallel. These anomalies did not immediately lead to conclusions of wrongdoing, as the system was accustomed to handling incomplete records due to interstate migration, changes in guardianship, or administrative errors lingering from years prior. However, when the Social Security number was used for procedures requiring higher verification, such as those related to advanced education or formal employment, the lack of linkage between data layers became evident, preventing the record from automatically passing standard checks. It was at that intersection that the teenager's personal record was first flagged at the federal level, not because of signs of criminal activity, but because the system detected a set of factors inconsistent with typical data patterns. This flagging occurred silently, like thousands of other cases each year, and did not trigger immediate action against the individual involved. Instead, it marked the record as one requiring review if and when new data emerged. For federal agencies, this was merely a technical signal, indicating that the identity lacked a seamless enough history to meet standardized criteria, rather than an issue warranting active investigation. However, the flag created an important anchor point in the system, where subsequent information could be automatically compared against other anomalous records rather than processed in isolation as before. Once flagged, the related data no longer remained static within one agency or state, but began to be forwarded through internal processing streams across multiple units. Basic identity information, the Social Security number, and administrative milestones were shared with agencies responsible for verification and cross-checking, to determine whether this was an isolated administrative error or a symptom of a larger systemic issue. This data transfer did not happen quickly or in a focused manner, but passed through multiple intermediate steps, each with its own priority threshold and dependent on the workload of individual units. In that context, the Wichita teenager's record became a small part of a vast data flow, stored and processed in sequence, awaiting the appropriate moment for deeper review. This reflected how the administrative system operates, not in response to individual stories, but according to statistical signals and standardized procedures. As data was transferred to other agencies, particularly those tasked with maintaining and cross-referencing federal databases, connections between seemingly unrelated records began to emerge. Cross-checking algorithms designed to identify potential matches between identities based on factors like date of birth, gender, demographic characteristics, and administrative history. In this case, the prolonged gaps in the teenager's record were no longer viewed as isolated phenomena, but stood out when compared to other records exhibiting similar inconsistency. Although no specific conclusion was reached, The system began to treat this as a case warranting monitoring, where any new information could trigger a deeper review cycle. The activation of cross-checking did not occur as a subjective human decision, but as the result of data accumulation over time, when the necessary conditions finally converged to exceed the alert threshold. These cross-checking mechanisms were built to operate in the background, continuously comparing and reconciling records without direct investigator intervention. In that context, the legal identity the Wichita teenager was using began to be placed alongside records of children missing from years earlier, not due to a specific suspicion, but because basic parameters started showing similarities that could not be ignored. This process unfolded slowly, step by step, with each comparison round either eliminating or retaining the possibility of a match, rather than reaching a definitive conclusion. For the individual living under that identity, everything continued normally, as there was no external notification or intervention. But at the system level, a significant shift had occurred. The record was no longer treated as an isolated administrative case, but as a potential intersection between the present and the past. The inconsistent Social Security number, the federally flagged record, the forwarded data, and the cross-checking had created a chain reaction without needing luck or human coincidence. Instead, it reflected how modern systems began to correct past deficiencies, not through intuition or memory, but by placing data fragments side by side and allowing anomalies to reveal themselves. At this stage, no one in the system could yet confirm that the Wichita identity was linked to a specific missing person case, and no direct investigation had been initiated. However, the marking of the record and its entry into cross-checking streams had created a decisive change. For the first time in years, this identity was no longer entirely detached from stories long forgotten in archives. The gaps once concealed by administrative fragmentation now became the very factors making the record stand out, opening the possibility that a long-interrupted story might be reconnected. In the silence of automated processes and interconnected databases, the administrative system had begun to do what humans and traditional investigative methods previously could not: question the existence of an identity by comparing it to what had once disappeared. The late 1990s marked a quiet but revolutionary shift in how U.S. government agencies handled information, as the wave of data digitization began gradually replacing fragmented paper archives that relied heavily on human memory. This process did not occur uniformly or instantly but was implemented in phases, prioritizing systems with large data volumes and frequent lookup needs, including personal administrative records and databases related to missing persons. Documents once stored in filing cabinets, accessible only manually and dependent on knowing exactly what to look for, were gradually converted into electronic records, enabling searches across multiple criteria. In that context, cases that had fallen into cold case status began to have opportunities for re-examination, not because of new evidence from the field, but because old data could finally be placed in the same processing space. This change did not produce immediate results, but it completely transformed how the system remembered the past, shifting from dispersed memory to centralized, cross-referenceable memory. Alongside digitization came the interconnection of data across state and federal agencies, a step aimed at overcoming the inherent limitations of managing information by administrative boundary. Previously, a record in Oklahoma and one in Kansas could exist completely separately unless there was a specific reason for a human to actively connect them. As systems began to link up, data was no longer trapped within one state, but could be queried and compared on a broader scale, based on common criteria such as date of birth, gender, identifying characteristics, and administrative identifier. This interconnection not only served current administrative needs, but also opened the possibility of rescreening old records from new perspectives, where anomalies once overlooked, due to lack of context, could now be identified when placed alongside other data. In that flow, records previously flagged for inconsistencies began to stand out more, as the system now had sufficient visibility to see that their irregularities were no longer isolated phenomena. It was within this process of interconnection and data enrichment that old records related to missing children were retrieved, not because of a specific investigative directive, but because they became part of the datasets needing standardization and integration. Missing persons cases from years earlier, once archived in cold case status, were converted to digital format and entered into new systems, allowing them to be searched and compared by algorithms rather than solely by flipping through paper files. For the disappearance of Jackson Hayes in Oklahoma City, this meant that basic identity information, the time of disappearance, and identifying characteristics were brought back into the lexicon of data rather than remaining dormant in storage. Even without new information added, the digitization and standardization of the old record created the necessary conditions for it to be compared with later emerging data from elsewhere. As databases were interconnected and old records brought into the system, the ability to detect potential matches emerged as a natural consequence of placing many data fragments together. Algorithms were designed to seek similarities that were not perfect matches, identifying anomalous patterns based on probability rather than absolute similarity. In that context, the legal identity in Wichita, already flagged for prolonged inconsistencies, began showing intersections with records of children missing from the late. These intersections were not clear enough for immediate conclusions, but they were sufficient to draw system attention, as coincidences in age, gender and timelines began exceeding what could be explained by chance. The detection of potential matches did not occur as a dramatic moment, but as a series of small signals, each increasing the record's priority in subsequent review cycles. What was significant at this stage was the change in the role of humans in the investigative process. Instead of having to recall or accidentally discover a connection, investigators began receiving suggestions from the system itself, based on large-scale data analysis previously impossible. Technology did not provide answers, but it posed new questions, forcing humans to revisit cases thought to be closed. For the Jackson Hayes disappearance, this meant the story was no longer confined to the context of 1987, but placed in a broader time frame, where events years later could hold decisive meaning. The emergence of potential matches did not immediately lead to action, as the system was designed to avoid hasty conclusions based on insufficiently strong data. Instead, it triggered a multi-layered evaluation chain, where each similarity had to be cross-verified with other sources before being deemed reliable. This process reflected a new philosophy in modern investigation, accepting that data could guide but not fully replace human judgment. In the silence of servers and automated processes, the record of a boy missing since 1987 and the record of a teenager growing up under a different identity began moving closer than ever. Not because a new witness appeared, but because technology finally allowed the system to see connections once obscured by time and fragmentation. This technological turning point did not close the story, but it completely altered the case's trajectory, shifting the focus from waiting for new information to remining what already existed. Data once considered static now became dynamic, capable of interacting and generating new meaning when placed together. In that context, the disappearance of Jackson Hayes was no longer just a dusty cold case, but a record revived within the system, ready for a new investigative phase where answers would come not from the scene or witnesses, but from the convergence of data, technology, and timing. As potential matches began to be highlighted by the system, the actual comparison process between the 1987 missing child record and the Wichita legal identity was conducted cautiously, step by step, and focused more on elimination than affirmation. The first step centered on comparing basic biological characteristics, factors least affected by environment and time, including gender, race, estimated height at different ages, blood type if available, and innate physical traits recorded in the original file. The Jackson Hayes record, though limited, still provided foundational information sufficient for comparison with medical and administrative data from the Wichita identity, particularly records of physical characteristics that change little over time. The comparison results did not produce an absolute match, but neither did clear contradictions strong enough to rule out the possibility that the two records belonged to the same person. It was this cannot be disproven state that allowed the matching process to continue, as in long-standing cases, the absence of contradiction sometimes carried weight equal to similarity. In parallel with biological factors, investigators and data analysts compared key timeline milestones in the two records, treating this as the backbone for assessing the feasibility of the match hypothesis. The date Jackson Hayes disappeared was placed alongside the date the Wichita identity first appeared in local administrative systems, creating a transition period reasonable enough not to be deemed implausible. There was no data recording the teenager's existence in Wichita before that point, nor any record showing Jackson Hayes continued to appear in Oklahoma after the disappearance was reported. Enrollment ages, initial medical service access dates, and early administrative interactions of the new identity were all compared to Jackson's presumed age, if he were still alive, and the results showed relative temporal alignment. However, this alignment remained within a range explainable by multiple scenarios, especially given early life data gaps, making it difficult to establish a seamless timeline. From the biological and temporal comparisons, the evaluation of match degree proceeded cumulatively, where each similarity increased probability, but no single point was strong enough to stand alone as decisive evidence. Analysts did not seek perfect similarity, understanding that over many years records could be distorted, information altered or missing, and legal identities adjusted to fit new living circumstances. Instead, they assessed the overall picture, asking whether any other reasonable scenario could simultaneously explain the complete disappearance of a child in Oklahoma and the appearance of a teenager with a fragmented record in Kansas. The answer was unclear, but the more analysis conducted, the harder it became to logically defend the possibility that the two records were entirely unrelated. Still, logic could not replace evidence, and this thus the evaluation in a state of suspicion rather than affirmation. Throughout this phase, investigators had to maintain a delicate balance between pursuing the match hypothesis and avoiding confirmation bias traps. They were acutely aware that once a hypothesis became compelling, the risk of unconsciously interpreting data to support it increased. Therefore, each similarity was paired with a counter question: could this detail appear in unrelated records, and what was the probability of random coincidence? This approach made progress slow but ensured that any next steps, if taken, rested on a solid foundation rather than sentiment or the desire to close a long-standing case. Another key factor in the matching phase was recognizing what could not be verified with existing data. There was no original birth record for comparison, no biological sample retained from when Jackson disappeared, and no direct witnesses able to connect the two identities through personal experience. These gaps created an evidentiary void that no administrative or statistical comparison could fully bridge. Investigators had to acknowledge that, despite rising suspicion, they still lacked sufficiently strong legal or scientific grounds to officially confirm identity. Reaching a conclusion at this point risked not only serious error, but potential long-term harm to the individual if the match hypothesis proved incorrect. For these reasons, the matching and suspicion phase ended in limbo, where the most critical question had been raised but could not yet be answered. Analyses showed a chain of similarities noteworthy enough to ignore, yet sufficient gaps to prevent a final conclusion. This state reflected the nature of many cold cases reopened in the data era. Technology could narrow the scope of suspicion, but could not complete the story on its own. For this case, the lack of conclusive grounds was not a sign of complete deadlock, but a necessary pause before crossing into a different investigative threshold, where identity confirmation would no longer rely on inference or probability, but require a more decisive form of evidence. When the matching process based on administrative data and logical analysis reached an insurmountable limit, the investigation faced a decisive choice: either accept leaving the suspicion in a state of indefinite suspension, or take one further step using a method capable of providing a definitive answer. In that context, DNA sampling was seen as the only path that could scientifically confirm or refute the matching hypothesis, but this decision was not made hastily. First, the investigators had to clearly identify the most suitable subject for sampling, a step that was not only technical, but also directly involved legal and ethical consideration. Potential subjects included the individual living under the identity in Wichita and the blood relatives of Jackson Hayes, those with a close enough genetic relationship to make DNA comparison yield reliable results. Determining the subject was based not only on technical feasibility, but also on assessing the degree of intrusion necessary into personal lives, because requesting a DNA sample meant taking a suspicion that had existed only within the internal system out of the data realm and into contact with real people. Parallel to identifying the subject, the necessary legal procedures were carefully reviewed to ensure that every step complied with regulations and avoided creating future legal risks. At this point, DNA sampling could not be conducted as a coercive measure, as there was no basis for officially determining criminal conduct or false identity. Instead, the investigators had to prepare a proposal dossier based on reasonable suspicion, clearly presenting the chain of analysis that led to this decision and identifying the legal basis for collecting the sample on a voluntary basis. This process required coordination among investigative units, legal departments, and relevant agencies to ensure that the sampling, if carried out, would not violate individual rights and could be legally used in subsequent verification steps. This caution reflected the awareness that a procedural error could invalidate the entire results, no matter how great their scientific value. Once the legal framework was established, the DNA sample collection was planned in a way that minimized psychological and social impact on those involved. Approaching the individual in Wichita, if done, had to be based on consent, with clear explanations of the purpose of the sampling and the scope of use for the biological data. At the same time, Jackson Hayes's family members were also considered for comparison, as their DNA could provide the necessary anchor points to confirm blood relationship. The collection process was designed according to current forensic standards, ensuring sample integrity and chain of custody traceability from the moment of collection to analysis. Though technically the sampling could be simple and quick, psychologically it marked a heavy moment, when participants had to confront the possibility that a story spanning many years was about to enter an irreversible phase. After the DNA samples were collected, they were transferred to a forensic laboratory for analysis under strict scientific standards. This process did not happen instantly, as each sample had to undergo multiple processing steps to ensure accuracy and eliminate risks of cross-contamination or errors. The analysts focused on identifying key genetic markers, DNA segments, capable of revealing direct or indirect blood relationship. In the context of a case spanning many years, the analysis also faced challenges from generational differences and the potential lack of perfect reference samples, making result interpretation require a high degree of caution. There was no room for speculation or emotional interpretation, as every conclusion had to be based on statistical probabilities and validated scientific standards. Parallel to the analysis, comparison work was prepared so that when results emerged, they could be placed accurately within the investigative context. The investigators reviewed the entire file, from the initial timelines to the suspicions formed after data digitization, to ensure that the DNA results, whether confirmatory or negative, were understood correctly and not detached from the overall picture. The comparison aimed not only to answer whether the two identities belonged to the same person, but also to assess the potential legal and social consequences arising from the result. A confirmatory conclusion would not just close a suspicion, but also trigger a series of issues related to legal identity, personal rights, and the responsibilities of involved agencies. Conversely, a negative conclusion also required careful handling to avoid unnecessary harm to those who had participated in the verification process. Throughout the waiting period for results, the investigation existed in a state of quiet tension, where all assumptions were temporarily suspended to make way for scientific evidence. The investigators understood that this was a point of no return. Once the DNA results were released, the story would shift to a new trajectory, regardless of the outcome. Therefore, the decision to take DNA samples was not just an operational step, but a commitment by the system to pursue the truth to the end, even if that truth proved more complicated, painful, or difficult to handle than previous hypotheses. At this moment, all prior investigative efforts, from the early days searching in the quiet neighborhood of Oklahoma City, to the complex data checks in the late 1990s, converged on a single point, where science was expected to provide the answer that time and silence had refused for many years. When the DNA analysis results were completed and returned to the investigative agency, the receipt process did not occur in a noisy or immediately dramatic atmosphere, but in one of caution and gravity, reflecting a clear awareness of the significance of the information about to be confirmed. The scientific report was reviewed according to proper procedure, with participation from forensic experts, key investigators, and the legal department, to ensure the conclusion was accurately understood in its statistical context and not interpreted beyond what the data allowed. The probability indicators were presented clearly, showing a blood relationship exceeding the scientific acceptance threshold, ruling out random coincidence at a level the legal system deemed acceptable. Receiving the DNA results, therefore, was not just accepting an answer but accepting a verified reality that forced the entire chain of long-standing suspicions to be viewed in a completely different light. From those results, the identity of the individual living in Wichita was scientifically confirmed as Jackson Hayes, the boy who disappeared from Oklahoma City in 1987 and was thought to have left no trace for over a decade. This confirmation was not speculative or emotional, but built on direct biological evidence, strong enough to overcome any lingering doubts from prior matching phases. For the investigators who had followed this case for years, the conclusion did not bring a simple sense of victory but a profound solemnity, as they realized that confirming the identity also meant acknowledging a prolonged series of system failures in detecting and intervening in time. Jackson Hayes was not just found, he was found in a context where a significant portion of his childhood and adolescence had been lost under a different identity, a reality no scientific result could reverse. Immediately after the identity was confirmed, the cold case file for Jackson Hayes' disappearance was officially reopened, marking the transition from archived status to active investigation. Reopening the file was not merely symbolic but triggered a series of operational consequences, including reviewing all documents collected since 1987, reassessing initial investigative decisions, and identifying points the system had missed or been unable to handle at the time. The file, once seen as a story without an ending, was now placed back on the desk with a new central question: what happened during the time Jackson disappeared, and who, if anyone, was responsible for separating him from his family for so many years? Reopening the file also meant reactivating federal-state coordination mechanisms, as the case was no longer just a resolved missing person, but one with federal elements involving cross-jurisdictional movement and potential prolonged legal violation. Parallel to reopening the file, an internal notification process was implemented to ensure all relevant units were fully and uniformly updated on the case's new status. The identity confirmation information was communicated through official channels, accompanied by clear guidelines on sharing scope and confidentiality, to prevent leaks that could harm the newly confirmed individual and related family. Departments that had handled the case in the past were, from a historical cold case file, it now became a live situation tied to a specific person existing in the present, with rights, emotions, and legal consequences that needed careful consideration. Investigators had to adjust their mindset from analyzing a closed story to handling an ongoing reality, where every decision directly impacted Jackson Hayes' life and those around him. This required close coordination not only among investigative units, but also with psychological, legal, and social service experts to ensure the next process did not cause unnecessary harm. The DNA results also forced the system to confront unavoidable questions about its own responsibility and limitation. Confirming the identity could not be separated from reviewing what had not been done in the past, from initial investigative assumptions to how resources were allocated and maintained. In internal meetings, the case was analyzed not just as a success of modern technology, but as a typical example showing the system's dependence on the context and tools of each era. What was impossible in 1987 was now feasible, but that did not diminish the reality that the time past could not be reclaimed. At this point, with internal notifications complete, the file reopened and identity confirmed, the case entered a new phase where the focus was no longer on who Jackson Hayes was, but on what happened to him during the years of disappearance and how to handle the lingering consequences of the newly confirmed truth. The DNA results, while providing scientific clarity, did not close the story. On the contrary, they opened a series of new questions and responsibilities, placing the investigative system before the challenge of shifting from seeking truth to confronting its consequences in the present. Immediately after Jackson Hayes' identity was confirmed by DNA and the cold case file was officially reactivated, authority over the case was transferred to the Specialized Cold Case Unit, a department designed to handle long-standing files with a focus not only on finding new evidence but also on re-evaluating the entire investigative process in the context of modern legal and technological standards. The Cold Case Unit taking over signified a restructuring of the case approach, as this team was not bound by initial assumptions and had the authority to re-ask questions once considered answered. The first step in reopening the investigation was a comprehensive review of the old 1987 file, including initial report intakes, family and witness interview transcripts, scene notes, search strategies, as well as classification decisions and resource allocation in the early phase. The goal of this review was not to search for traditionally overlooked clues, but to assess the reasonableness of each decision in its contemporary context, to understand why the case had followed a trajectory leading to deadlock and prolongation over many years. During the review, the Cold Case Unit reanalyzed the investigative assumptions formed in 1987, particularly the initial classification of the case and the failure to prioritize an adult intervention scenario early on. The investigators noted that many decisions were based on societal and professional standards common to that era, when the concept of child abduction by strangers was not fully recognized and supportive technology was virtually non-existent. The lack of violent signs at the open scene led to maintaining multiple simultaneous assumptions without clear prioritization, causing resources to be dispersed in the most critical early days. Additionally, heavy reliance on witness statements in an environment prone to memory distortion increased timeline ambiguity, preventing time gaps from being narrowed enough for focused in-depth investigation. The Cold Case Unit recorded that these limitations did not stem from negligence or individual incompetence, but from systemic and knowledge constraints at the time. An important part of reopening the investigation was identifying specific errors or omissions that may have directly affected the case outcome. Among them, the lack of an effective federal tracking mechanism for missing children crossing state lines was seen as a key factor, as it allowed Jackson to be taken out of the area without triggering widespread alert. Furthermore, the failure to preserve biological samples or more detailed identification data in the early phase was evaluated as a major limitation, though at the time there was no clear awareness of the long-term value of such data. The Cold Case Unit also examined how sighting reports were handled, noting that waves of noisy information contributed to slowing strategic decision-making, as the initial team was forced to respond to each report individually rather than restructuring the investigative direction when deadlock became evident. Identifying these errors was not aimed at assigning personal blame, but at creating an honest picture of how the system operated and the points needing future improvement. After completing the review and assessment of past errors, the Cold Case Unit shifted focus to evaluating prosecutorial viability related to the case, a task far more complex than identity confirmation. The investigators had to consider whether there was sufficient legal basis to establish specific criminal conduct, and if so, whether those bases retained value after many years or had been eroded by time. Factors to weigh included identifying who was directly responsible for removing Jackson from Oklahoma City, the motive for that act, and the degree of evidence capable of proving legal violation under applicable statutes at the time of occurrence. The Cold Case Unit also had to confront legal barriers such as statutes of limitations, the absence of direct witnesses, and the possibility that physical evidence no longer existed or did not meet courtroom-proof standards. The prosecutorial viability assessment was conducted in parallel with consultations with prosecutors to determine the boundary between what could be further investigated and what was legally insurmountable. In many scenarios considered, building a strong enough file for criminal prosecution faced significant difficulties, as most events occurred outside system oversight and left no independently verifiable trace. Even with Jackson Hayes's identity confirmed, proving specific criminal conduct with all required legal elements remained a major challenge. The Cold Case Unit had to acknowledge that finding the victim alive, though a turning point, did not automatically equate to the ability to pursue criminal accountability, especially when key events occurred in long data void. Nevertheless, reopening the investigation was not limited to prosecution as the sole goal, but also aimed to clarify the context and sequence of events that led to Jackson living under a different identity for so long. The Cold Case Unit saw this as an opportunity to reconstruct the story as completely as possible, not only for legal purposes, but also to provide transparency and answers for the family and Jackson Hayes himself. Determining what could and could not be done at this stage helps set realistic expectations for involved parties, avoiding the fostering of hopes mismatched with system capability. In that context, reopening the investigation became an effort to balance pursuing justice with acknowledging evidential limits, where every step had to be carefully weighed to avoid causing further harm while attempting to close a long and complex chapter in the Jackson Hayes case. After the Cold Case Unit completed the steps to reopen the investigation and determined the actual legal limitations of the case, the focus of the work shifted to a much more sensitive phase, directly approaching the victim and Jackson Hayes's biological family, no longer as files to be analyzed, but as human beings facing a truth that could completely upend their perception of their lives. Before any contact took place, psychological preparation was prioritized, because the investigators understood that confirming identity was not just about reunion, but also carried the risk of causing deep trauma if communicated improperly. Psychologists and victim counselors were consulted to develop a step-by-step approach plan aimed at minimizing the initial shock and creating space for those involved to process their emotions safely. This preparation included assessing the current mental state of the individual living under a different identity, their ability to absorb information that fundamentally altered their sense of self, as well as anticipating the reactions of the Hayes family, who had lived for years in a state of waiting and loss. The goal was not to achieve an immediate reaction or positive emotions right away, but to ensure that the truth was received under fully supportive conditions, rather than becoming an uncontrolled psychological collision. In parallel with the psychological preparation, a multi-layered verification process was implemented to ensure that all information used in the approach phase was accurate, consistent, and left no gaps that could cause confusion. Although the DNA results provided decisive scientific evidence, the investigators still conducted a final review of related data, including administrative records, the reconstructed timeline, and current investigative conclusions, to ensure no details were contradictory or unresolved. This multi-layered verification was not intended to re-question the identity, but to prepare a complete picture so that when the information was conveyed, it could answer the basic questions that the victim and family would certainly ask. Consistency in the information was seen as a key factor in building trust, especially in a context where those involved might feel abandoned or failed by the system for many years. When all necessary conditions were established, the disclosure of the true identity was carried out in a carefully considered sequence, starting with the individual living under the different identity. The contact was not conducted as an interrogation or administrative notification, but as a dialogue with the presence of support experts, where the focus was on providing information honestly, but without imposition. The disclosure did not happen through a brief statement, but through a guided process, allowing the individual to gradually approach the truth, from the suspicions that had existed in the records to the undeniable scientific conclusion. The investigators and psychological counselors had to continuously observe reactions, adjusting the pace and level of detail to avoid emotional overload. For the person just informed that they were in fact Jackson Hayes, this truth did not just reset a name, but reset their entire personal history, suddenly providing an explanation for vague memories, feelings of not belonging, and previous identity gaps, even though that explanation came with unavoidable shock and pain. After this individual was informed and given initial time to absorb the truth, the approach to the Hayes family was implemented with similar caution, if not greater. The family, having endured years of hope and disappointment, was psychologically prepared before receiving the confirmation, to avoid facing life-changing news in a state of complete surprise. The notification to the family was not carried out as a moment of celebration or complete resolution, but as the beginning of a complex journey ahead. The investigators and support experts clearly explained the DNA results, what had been confirmed, and what remained gaps, to prevent the family from building unrealistic expectations about reunion or the possibility of criminal prosecution. In that moment, joy, pain, relief, and a sense of loss could coexist, reflecting the non-linear nature of emotions in reunions after years of separation. In addition to the psychological aspects, initial legal support was considered an inseparable part of the approach phase, because confirming identity brought a series of legal consequences that needed to be handled systematically. Legal advisors were mobilized to explain to Jackson Hayes and the family the next steps related to legal identity, citizenship rights, and necessary procedures to adjust administrative records. This included clarifying that the identity used for many years, though not reflecting biological truth, still existed in the system and needed to be handled carefully to avoid unwanted consequences. The family was also advised on their rights and obligations related to the case, including legal limitations on pursuing accountability and possible options if they wished to pursue civil actions or request support from social agencies. Throughout the approach process, a consistent principle was maintained, prioritizing the victim's well-being and psychological safety above all other operational goals. The investigators recognized that finding Jackson Hayes alive did not close the story, but opened a new phase, where rebuilding life and personal identity was just as important as clarifying past events. Therefore, all information provided was accompanied by emphasis that there was no obligation to make immediate decisions, no pressure to reunite in a specific mold, and no expectation to meet the emotions of any party beyond the victim's own need. This flexibility was seen as essential to prevent turning a case-resolving discovery into a new source of trauma. As the phase of approaching the victim and family gradually concluded, the investigative system shifted to a role of support and monitoring, rather than leading. The psychological preparation, multi-layered verification, true identity disclosure, and initial legal support had created a safe framework for the truth to be received and processed, even though the road ahead remained full of uncertainty. At this point, Jackson Hayes was no longer just a name in a cold case file, but a person standing before the opportunity to reconnect with his past, with his biological family, and with himself, while the system, this time, played the role of backing rather than missing the mark. The reunion between Jackson Hayes and his biological family did not unfold as a pre-scripted explosion of emotion, but as a cautious process, where every step forward had to be weighed to avoid adding pressure to people already carrying prolonged trauma. The family meeting was organized in a controlled setting, with the presence of psychological support experts and agency representatives, to ensure the encounter was not dominated by expectations or extreme emotion. For the Hayes family, the moment of seeing Jackson after many years did not bring a sense of complete return, but a collision between memories of an 11-year-old boy and the reality of an adult with a life, experiences, and identity formed elsewhere. For Jackson, facing his biological family was not just meeting relatives by blood, but confronting a part of his past, never fully lived, creating complex emotions of curiosity, unfamiliarity, connection, and resentment. The meeting was therefore not seen as an endpoint, but as the starting point for a relationship that needed time to reshape, not according to the mold of disappearance and return, but according to the reality of two lives separated for many years. In parallel with the initial personal contacts, handling legal procedures was implemented systematically to address the administrative consequences arising from identity confirmation. Relevant agencies coordinated to review and adjust records, from identification documents, civil registry files, to data related to citizenship rights and legal obligations. This process did not happen quickly, as it required balancing the recognition of Jackson Hayes's true identity with the lawful handling of the identity that had existed for many years. Legal advisors worked closely with Jackson to explain each step, ensuring all decisions were made voluntarily and with full understanding, rather than imposed by external pressure. The Hayes family was also guided on their legal role and responsibilities in the new context, including limitations and options related to supporting Jackson in adjusting his life. Adjusting identity was not just a paperwork procedure, but a process with profound impact on Jackson's sense of self. Transitioning from a familiar identity to recognizing his true name and history raised non-simple questions about who Jackson had become, and which parts of his previous life needed to be kept or let go. The authorities, in a supportive role, avoided imposing a full return, instead creating conditions for Jackson to gradually integrate his true identity into his current life at a suitable pace. This included allowing elements of the old life to coexist during a transition period, to minimize psychological shock and avoid turning the adjustment into a new rupture. For the Hayes family, this adjustment also required adaptation, as they had to learn to see Jackson not just as the lost child, but as an adult with autonomy and personal boundaries that needed respect. Throughout the entire reunion phase, a consistent principle was maintained: not idealizing the outcome. Investigators, support experts, and the family were all reminded that finding Jackson alive, though a rare and greatly relieving result, could not erase the lost years or automatically heal all wounds. Differences in life experiences, personal values, and social relationships did not disappear just because the truth was confirmed. Instead, they became factors that needed to be acknowledged and handled realistically if a sustainable relationship was to be built in the future. Not idealizing also helped reduce pressure on Jackson, preventing him from being placed in the role of meeting family or societal expectations for a perfect happy ending. The reunion was therefore viewed as an open process, where success was not measured by the intensity of initial emotions, but by the ability of those involved to respect each other's pace and boundary. Subsequent meetings, if any, were planned flexibly, allowing necessary distance and rest time for emotions to be processed gradually. The support system continued its backing role, ready to intervene when needed, but avoiding overly deep control over the forming relationship. This reflected the understanding that reunion after years of separation was not a return to the past, but the building of a new present, based on the newly confirmed truth. As the initial reunion phase drew to a close, Jackson Hayes and his family entered a new reality, where identity, relationships, and expectations were all being redefined. There was no clear endpoint for this process, as adjustment and healing are ongoing tasks, requiring patience and acceptance that some losses cannot be fully compensated. However, acknowledging those limitations helped the reunion avoid dangerous idealization, opening the possibility for a more authentic relationship, where truth was not obscured by perfect stories, but used as a foundation for everyone to move forward, even though the road ahead remained full of unpredictability. After Jackson Hayes's identity was confirmed, and the initial reunion took place within a supportive framework, the unavoidable question gradually arose in both the investigative system and the family. Who took Jackson away from Oklahoma City and whether that person could be held accountable. Identifying the person who took Jackson was not based on a confession or direct evidence, but through reconstructing the context and connections that existed around the time he disappeared, combined with limited accounts from Jackson himself about the early years under the different identities. This information, while helping to narrow down the possibility that Jackson was taken by an adult with intent, was still insufficient to identify a specific individual with the certainty needed for criminal charges. In many scenarios considered, the person who took Jackson may have exploited trust, lacks community supervision, and societal norms of that era, to act without leaving clear traces, making identification after many years nearly impossible. The current legal status of the suspected person, if still alive, was another complicating factor the cold case unit had to face. There was no official record of a kidnapping at the time of the incident, and no administrative or criminal data directly linking a specific individual to taking Jackson out of state. The passage of time not only faded witness memories, but completely changed the legal context, as involved individuals may have moved, changed identities, or passed away. Even if a potential suspect was identified, pursuing accountability would face numerous barriers, from statutes of limitations, the ability to collect valid evidence, to proving coercion or deception under the legal standards applicable, and these barriers made the prospect of bringing the case to trial fragile, even though the truth about Jackson being separated from his family had been confirmed. The lack of prosecutable evidence was the central reality shaping all legal assessments at this stage. There was no preserved physical evidence, no biological records or crime scene traces for comparison, and no independent testimony strong enough to accurately recreate the criminal act under criminal proof standards. What remained was mostly inference based on the chain of events and data gaps, enough to form a reasonable picture of what likely happened, but not enough to meet the beyond a reasonable doubt threshold courts require. Prosecutors, when consulted, had to acknowledge that pursuing a prosecution in this context carried a high risk of failure, not only due to lack of evidence, but also the risk of causing further trauma to the victim and family if the legal process dragged on without result. Therefore, although the question of the perpetrator remained, the system had to weigh the need for justice against the responsibility not to create unfulfillable expectations. These difficulties exposed systemic gaps from the past, particularly how child disappearance cases were handled in the late. The absence of effective federal coordination mechanisms, non-standardized identification data storage, and limited awareness of stranger abductions created an environment where a child could vanish without leaving strong enough traces for long-term investigation. These gaps were not just technical but reflected an incomplete societal view of child safety and community responsibility, where surface calm was seen as sufficient to reduce vigilance. In Jackson Hayes's case, these gaps converged, allowing a child to be separated from his family without timely prevention and without leaving clear legal marks. The inability to prosecute the perpetrator, if any, did not mean the system denied responsibility or considered the case fully resolved. Instead, it presented a hard-to-accept reality. There are cases where the truth about the victim can be clarified, but traditional legal justice cannot be achieved. For the Hayes family and Jackson himself, this gap could create a sense of incompleteness, as the question "who did this" lacked an official answer. However, investigators and support experts tried to frame it so that the lack of prosecution did not negate the value of the confirmed truth or diminish the significance of Jackson being alive and having the chance to rebuild his life under his true identity. On a broader level, the case became evidence of the need for reforms implemented later, from interconnected missing persons databases, emergency response protocols for children, to long-term identification data storage and preservation. Those reforms, though unable to change what happened in 1987, helped minimize the persistence of similar gaps in the future. In that context, the legal gap in Jackson Hayes's case was not just an isolated failure, but a reminder of the cost of systemic limitations and society's responsibility to prevent other children from falling into the same blind spot of law and collective memory. When Jackson Hayes's story is viewed in its full span of over a decade of disappearance and reappearance, the greatest significance of the case lies not in a verdict or conviction, but in how science and technology changed the ability to uncover truth within limits that traditional investigation could not overcome. The role of DNA in this case was decisive, not just because it confirmed Jackson's identity undeniably, but because it did what time, memory, and paper records could not: connect two seemingly unrelated people through a specific biological link. In the context of a long-drawn case, DNA did not appear as a magical tool solving everything, but as a scientific anchor allowing the system to reach a definitive conclusion when all other methods stopped at suspicion. It was precisely the ability to transcend the subjective limits of human memory and administrative fragmentation that made DNA central, not only in confirming Jackson Hayes's identity, but in how modern society approaches long-term missing persons cases. In parallel with technology's role, the case also clearly exposed the limits of traditional investigation when facing situations without clear physical traces. The initial efforts in 1987 were carried out within the available knowledge and tools, but the lack of data, technology, and federal coordination caused the investigation to hit a deadlock early. Relying on vague witness statements, an open scene with no signs of violence, and common societal assumptions of that era created an investigative foundation easily scattered and hard to maintain focus. Jackson Hayes's case shows that traditional investigation, though essential and irreplaceable in the initial response phase, has inherent limits when time drags on and initial data is not strong enough. These limits do not reflect personal failure by investigators, but the constraints of a system not yet designed to handle complex scenarios outside familiar patterns. From those very limits, the value of reviewing and reopening cold cases became clearly evident. If Jackson Hayes's file had simply been archived permanently without a mechanism to revisit and re-ask questions, the truth about his identity might never have been confirmed. Cold case review is not about seeking new evidence from a lost scene, but the process of placing old data in a new context, where modern technology and analysis methods can create connections previously invisible. In this case, the combination of data digitization, interstate federal linking, and matching algorithms created the conditions for a fragmented identity to be placed next to a forgotten missing persons file. This shows that cold cases do not mean dead cases, but files waiting for the right conditions to be re-understood, as long as the system maintains commitment not to close them just for lack of short-term progress. Closing the Jackson Hayes case in terms of identification carries special meaning, as it allows a clear distinction between two often conflated concepts: resolving the case and achieving full justice. In this instance, confirming Jackson's identity and returning him to his true name was a profoundly meaningful resolution, even without prosecution or conviction. It affirmed that, at least on a human level, the truth about Jackson being alive and who he is had been clarified, ending a suspended state that lasted many years. Closing in terms of identification does not erase unanswered questions about the perpetrator or motive, but it puts a period on the ambiguity of identity, which had been the greatest burden for both victim and family. On a broader scale, the case becomes a lesson in how society should view and invest in child protection systems and long-term data management. The success of identity confirmation did not come from one individual or moment, but from the accumulation of many small improvements in technology, law, and investigative thinking across decades. It shows that preserving data, though seemingly redundant at the outset, can yield immeasurable value years later when old questions need answers from new tools. At the same time, the case also emphasizes the importance of viewing victims not just as investigative subjects, but as people with ongoing lives beyond the file, with needs to be confirmed, supported and respected. Ultimately, the deepest significance of the Jackson Hayes case lies in closing a long chapter of uncertainty, not with perfection, but with honesty. The story does not end with a trial or sentencing, but with calling a person by their rightful name, placing a life once severed from itself back in its proper place. In the world of true crime, where justice is often measured by legal outcomes, this case reminds us that sometimes returning identity and truth to the victim is already a profoundly meaningful form of justice. It does not erase what was lost, but it allows those involved to move forward without being bound by the question of not knowing. Closing the case in terms of identification and leaving a clear message that even the dustiest files can find light, if the system and society do not abandon the effort to seek truth. The Jackson Hayes story offers a very practical American lesson. Child safety and the ability to recover missing persons cannot rely solely on the feeling that this neighborhood is peaceful, but must be based on habits, data and procedure. In 1987 in Oklahoma City, Jackson vanished in an open scene with no signs of violence, causing the investigation to quickly spiral into sighting tips, mistaken verifications, and fragmented resources. By the time the case went cold, time had become the enemy. The first lesson is that families need a clear, unified alert threshold. An 11-year-old losing contact beyond a short time frame, 10-15 minutes in normal circumstances, should trigger an organized search plan, an immediate report to authorities, rather than just searching informally before calling police. Second, always have an updated identification packet ready, recent photo descriptions of distinguishing features, scars, moles, braces, clothing when leaving home, and list of usual routes destinations. Because in this story, the lack of physical evidence and time gaps made every investigative assumption vague. Third, at the community level, do not downplay unusual administrative signs in Wichita, inconsistent school records, incomplete medical files, avoidance of authorities were red flags scattered so no one connected them. Today, with better data connectivity, parents and schools need to know the right channels to report children with inconsistent paperwork or signs of control. And finally, understand that outcomes are not idealized. Reunion can happen thanks to DNA and digitized data, but it comes with long-term healing. Therefore, the top priority remains prevention and early response, before a child has to grow up under a different identity. If you found the Jackson Hayes story helpful in better understanding the value of data, technology and vigilance in protecting children, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other cold cases analyzed in depth and detail. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video, where a file thought forgotten may once again be called by its rightful name.